Well, good evening, young people. Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Ethan. Now, first of all, is Annie Kempster here? Yeah? And did you do Heritage Morning Radio this morning? I did. And you did? And who did you announce was doing the talk tonight, Annie? Yeah. Annie had no idea. Well, I'm the one doing the talk. Does anyone know what a porter is? Does anyone, not a potter, because that was what some people thought it was going to be, but a porter. Does anyone know what a porter is? Doorkeeper. A doorkeeper, right, good. A doorkeeper or a gatekeeper, okay? Now, see why we read this reading tonight from verse 10. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness, all right? So just put that psalm away in the back of your mind, because what we want to do tonight is we want to look at where the doorkeepers or where the porters in Israel came from, how one famous family in Israel filled that role of porters in the history of Israel, and how they continued to do that for 1,000 years, okay? One family continued to do that for 1,000 years. Then we want to look at several well-known Bible characters who you might not have realised were porters or doorkeepers in the temple of God. And then finally, what it means to be a porter today, all right? So that's how we want to look at this topic tonight. But first of all, come back to Exodus chapter 6 and pull out your pens and your paper and your notepads, or get ready to write in your Bibles. And this family tree here is where we're going to start in Exodus chapter 6. Now, Exodus chapter 6, the children of Israel are still in Egypt. Moses has just gone to see Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh has said to Moses, sorry, I forgot to put on the special little microphone. Pharaoh has just said to Moses, "Well, you've obviously got too much time on your hands. You need to now get your own straw, and then you need to still make the same amount of bricks, all right?" And so how would you feel if you were an Israelite at that point? You would think, "Moses, shut your mouth." That would be the first thing you'd say. "And stop hassling that king, where we don't have a very nice life, but it was better than what you've just got us now." And so when we get to Exodus chapter 6, we read in verse 14, "These be the heads of their fathers' houses," okay? So what we're going to read about is people or men who are famous in the nation of Israel, although they're not the nation of Israel at this time, but they're famous men who are the heads of their fathers' houses and influential, men of renown, okay? And when we come to verse 16, some of these names are of the sons of Levi, according to their generations: Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. So this is the first line of our family tree. Levi had 3 sons that are mentioned here: Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. When we get to verse 18, the sons of Kohath were Amram, Izhar, and Hebron, and Uzziel. Now, we're not worried too much about Hebron and Uzziel at the moment for the purpose of this family tree, but we've got Izhar and Amram. Now, we remember that Amram married Jochebed and had Moses, Aaron, and what was her name? Miriam. That's right. Well done. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. It's good that you remember that, because I'd forgotten that. I had a mental blank. Now, what we want to do is we want to now look at these group of cousins here, okay? So in verse 21, the son of Izhar, Korah, Nepheg, and Zikri. So Korah, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were all cousins to each other. They're all on the same level of the family tree. And then when we get to verse 24, the sons of Korah were Asa, Elkanah, and Abiasaph. These are the families of the Korites. So when you're reading through the Bible, if you read about the Korites, you're reading about, this family here. If you're reading about the Kohathites, you're sort of reading about this slightly wider group of people here that came from Kohath. And if you're reading about the Levites, you're reading about the whole lot. But Korah was a Kohathite and he was also a Levite. Same with these guys. Elkanah was a Korite, a Kohathite, or a Levite. You can use those names interchangeably. Does that make sense with that family tree? All right? So I want you to just draw that in or keep that in the back of your mind, what that family tree looks like. Because when we come to Exodus chapter 32, we have the incident of the golden calf. And remember, Moses came down from the Mount Sinai and he stood outside the camp and he said, "Who is on the Lord's side?" Right? And who responded? It was the Levites, wasn't it? It was this family that came to Moses and said, "We are on the Lord's side." And he said, "All right, now go through the camp and kill whoever is messing about." Whether, and that could include your own sons and daughters, your brothers and sisters, and someone close to you. I want you to take your sword and go through that camp and kill who is messing about. And because this family of the Levites did this, God said, "Right, you're my special chosen tribe now. I can trust you. And you are going to lead this nation spiritually." And Korah and his sons were some of those that stood aside that day. Korah on that occasion had made a faithful decision to stand aside from the messing about and the worship that was going on with the golden calf. And he acted faithfully. He acted wisely. And he's around the same age as Moses and Aaron at that point in time. So he could have been like somewhere between 80 and 100 years old, Korah at that time. But come over to Numbers chapter 16. Because not too far down the track, Korah makes a foolish decision, doesn't he? And he challenges the priesthood of Aaron. He challenges God's choice of priest, and he wants it for himself. And he's part of this incident in Numbers chapter 16 of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And it's a bit odd, isn't it? That as a mature man, as a mature old man who has once made faithful decisions in his life, he now has a bit of a change of heart. He now makes a foolish error in his life through pride. And he causes many people in that nation of Israel to go down a path of sinfulness. But when we come to Numbers chapter 16, in verse 24, Moses says, or Yahweh says to Moses in verse 24, "Speak unto the congregation, saying, Get you up from about the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." And why? Why does he say to get away from them? Well, verse 31, he says, "It came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them. And the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. They and all that appertained to them, and went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation." That's a pretty serious incident, isn't it? Like, from a faithful man who stood aside at the incident of the golden calf to perishing in the earth when the ground opened up and swallowed Korah and everything that he had. And yet there's a twist to this story, which you might have heard of before. There's a twist that we find, and if it weren't recorded in Numbers 26, which is where I want you to go now, we would think that Korah and all of his sons and all of his family and everybody that was associated with his family had gone into that pit as well. But in Numbers 26, when Moses numbers the people, we find something odd in verse 10 and 11. And we find in Numbers 26, verse 10 and 11, Moses is describing the incident and says, "The earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up together with Korah when that company died. What time the fire devoured 250 men. And they became a sign against rebelliousness. Notwithstanding, the children of Korah died not. And without that verse there, we would not have this understanding that these sons of Korah, the children of Korah, stood aside from their dad on that day. Just in the same way that Korah had stood aside from the nation of Israel when they were worshipping the golden calf, Korah's own children now stood aside from his unfaithful decision that he'd made to challenge God's high priest. And as a result, they did not go down into the earth and perish. They stayed alive. And on that day that Korah died, a legacy was born. A legacy of a family or a group of people within the nation of Israel that became known as the sons of Korah. Not the Korahites, but the sons of Korah. They took their dad's name, which had ended in shame, and they said, we can't divorce ourselves from that man because he had once acted in faith and he had taught us faithful things, but we are not our father. We are the sons of Korah. And that name went on for over 1,000 years in faithful service in the nation of Israel. And even today, has anyone heard of the sons of Korah, the group, the singing group, right? So it's still associated with faithful worship in things of God today. All right? And that was the legacy that was born. Now come back to Numbers chapter 1. And let's have a look at this family of Kohath here, which included Korah and his sons, the sons of Korah. Numbers chapter 1, and we want to have a look at verse 47 to 54. Okay, and once again, we're reading about the numbering of Israel in Numbers chapter 1. And if you look in verse 45, so were all those that were numbered of the children of Israel by the house of their fathers from 20 years old and upward, all that were able to go forth to war in Israel. So when they numbered the nation of Israel, they specifically looked at healthy young men who were able to go to war older than 20 years old. Now, who does that exclude? Well, that excludes the women. That excludes the children. That excludes you if you had a disability of some sort. But look who else it excluded. It excluded you if you were too old and couldn't go out to fight. There's a lot of people in the numbering of the nation of Israel that were not included in that number. But have a look at verse 47. The Levites, after the tribe of their fathers, were not numbered among them. Now we'll look at the reason why that was the case later on, okay? But the Levites were not numbered in the number of Israel that were able to go to war. For Yahweh had spoken unto Moses, saying, Only thou shalt not number the tribe of Levi, neither take the sum of them among the children of Israel. But thou shalt appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of testimony, and over all the vessels thereof, and over all the things that belong to it. They shall bear the vessel, and all the vessels thereof, and they shall minister unto it, and they shall encamp about the tabernacle. Now, pardon me, I don't know if you've looked at the four-square encampment of Israel, but just to refresh your minds of it, you've got the tabernacle here, all right, with the fence around the tabernacle, and then all around the outside, 3 tribes on either side. Don't forget this is east, okay, because the tabernacle faces east. 3 tribes on either side in the four-square encampment. You're familiar with that, okay? But in between the gap between the tabernacle and where the tribe started, in this area here is where the Levites lived. Okay, that's what that verse is telling us there. You will encamp, at the end of verse 50, the Levites shall encamp around the tabernacle. And there was 3 things that the Levites had to do in verse 51. When the tabernacle sets forward, the Levites will take it down. When the tabernacle is to be pitched, the Levites shall set it up, and the stranger that comes nigh shall be put to death. So there was 3 things that these Levites had to do. 1, they opened worship in the tabernacle. Worship in the tabernacle did not start until the Levites had set that tabernacle up. They closed worship. All right? And thirdly, they protected worship. Okay? So they opened worship, they set the tabernacle up. When it was time to move on, they packed the tabernacle down, and they camped around here to protect the tabernacle from any strangers coming before God that should not have been there. That was the 3 things that these Levites had to do. In verse 52, the children of Israel shall pitch their tents, every man by his own camp, and every man by his own standard throughout their hosts. But the Levites shall pitch around the tabernacle of the testimony, that there be no wrath upon the congregation of the children of Israel. And the Levites, and note this phrase down, shall keep the charge of the tabernacle of the testimony. Okay? Keep the charge. Now, the reason we need to note that is because that phrase is going to come up over and over and over again. So that was the role of the Levites in the nation of Israel. Every tribe had its own standard. All right? And remember, you know what a standard is? Like a banner that they walked under. Well, the standard of the Levites was the tabernacle, or the ark, if you wanted. That was their standard. God was their standard that they marched under. But that's a summary of the role of the Levites. Now come over to Numbers chapter 3, just a page over. So that was what all of this family did. Now we're going to specifically focus on the family of Kohath, right? They were part of this, but we're going to now look more specifically at the family of Kohath, of which came the sons of Korah. Numbers chapter 3 and verse 31 and 32. So starting in verse 7, and of Kohath was the family of the Amramites, and the family of the Izrahites, and the family of the Hebronites, and the family of the Uzzielites. These are the families of the Kohathites, okay? So that's who we're talking about. Verse 31. And their charge, remember that phrase, keep the charge? So the family of the Kohathites, including Korah and the sons of Korah, their charge shall be the ark, the table, the candlestick, the altars, and the vessels of the sanctuary, wherewith they minister, and the hanging and all the service thereof. And Eleazar the son of Aaron the priest shall be chief over the chief of the Levites, and shall have oversight of them that keep the charge of the sanctuary. There's that phrase again, a second time. So this family, they had to guard and protect all of the vessels that came out of that tabernacle. What would happen is when they packed up, the sons of Aaron would go into the tabernacle and cover everything up. And then the family of the Kohathites would go in, and only when Aaron had covered it all up and his sons, could they pick up those pieces of furniture and then carry them on their shoulders when the nation set off, okay? No one else in the nation of Israel got to touch the ark, but the family of the Kohathites did. They were literally able to walk up and touch the ark and pick that thing up and carry it on their shoulders and bear it wherever the nation of Israel went. There was a special privilege that God gave to that family. And they had to keep it safe, didn't they? They had to protect it. They had to guard it. Can you imagine when the Amalekites attacked you? what you would think when you were carrying this solid gold object. You knew it was solid gold. And there was Amalekites attacking the rear of your nation, right? Your job was to guard it and protect it, and to keep it so that it was there for the service of the nation. Now, when we have a look at chapter 4, all right, and we want to have a look at verse 1 to 3, all right, but let's just start reading verse 1. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, take the sum of the sons of Kohath. So we're reading about this family again. And in verse 3, from 30 years old and upward, even until 50 years old, all that enter into the host to do the work in the tabernacle of the congregation, this shall be the service of the sons of Kohath in the tabernacle of the congregation about the most holy things. So you could not carry any of those items in the tabernacle until you were 30 years old. Now that excludes probably most of you in this room. But you only had a 20-year working life, okay? By the time you were 50, it was, thanks very much, don't come Monday. Now that's pretty rough, isn't it? Because Uncle Matt is out. I'm still serving, right? I'll turn 40 this year, so I'm right in the middle of it. But Uncle Matt's gone. He's out. Any other 50-year-olds up the back here? There's a few of you. Yeah, you're out. Sorry, don't come Monday. You've been fired. Now, that's rough, isn't it? Like, Uncle Matt is not a weak man. He's still perfectly capable of carrying a solid gold ark, I'm sure. What's God doing here? Well, come over the page, all right? Come over the page to verse 23. Now, this is talking about the family of Gershom. So this is talking about this family line here. But the same principle applies to all three of these families. But if you've got a King James version, there's just a little nuance that I want you to pick up out of verse 23. From 30 years old and upwards until 50 years old shalt thou number all that enter in to perform the service, to do the work in the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, if you've got a King James version, a wide margin, you should have a number 3 there next to perform the service. And in the margin, another translation of that phrase, perform the service, is the warfare. So remember, the Levites were not included in the number of those that went to war. That's because protecting this sanctuary was their warfare. That's what God saw as their role at war in the nation. You are fighting the fight of spirituality. And God said, that's where I want you to concentrate your efforts. And he repeats it again in verse 30. From 30 years old and upwards, even unto 50 years old, shalt thou number them, every one that entereth into the service, who wars the warfare to do the work of the tabernacle of the congregation. That time it's talking about the family of Merari. So God saw service in the tabernacle as warring the warfare. But what happened after 50? After 20 years of warring this spiritual warfare, what happened? We'll have a look at Numbers chapter 8. Now, this section here is talking specifically about the family of Aaron and his sons, all right? But the same phrases are used. And you'll notice that for Aaron and his family, you could start working in the tabernacle 5 years earlier, okay? When you actually went about doing the sacrifices and the offerings and that sort of stuff. So in verse 24, from 25 years old and upward, they shall go in to wait upon the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. And from the age of 50 years old, they shall cease waiting upon the service thereof and will serve no more. Now see, there's 2 phrases there. To wait upon the service. In King James, there's a little 2 and it says to war the warfare. So you read that, from 25 years old and upward, you will go in to war the warfare of the tabernacle in the congregation. And in the next verse, from the age of 50 years old, you will return from warfare and will serve no more. That's where the Hebrew reads, okay? So you go to war at 25, you cease warfare at 50. What do you do after 50? But in verse 26, you'll minister with their brethren in the tabernacle of the congregation, and here's that phrase that we had before, to keep the charge and do no service. They weren't to go out to war anymore. They were to guard those that were warfaring on their behalf. You became a guard, security, a protector of all that went on in this tabernacle. You became a guardian of the spiritual things in that nation. That's what you did after 50. Because you knew how to fight. You knew how to sacrifice. You knew how to do all those physical things. And in the prime of your life, while you still had strength and you were still capable of doing that work, God said, I now want you to swallow your pride. I want you to stand aside from that physical work. You might be the best carcass skinner that ever walked the face of the earth. And God said, right, now I want you to stand aside. I want you to allow a 25-year-old to come along and do that work. And I want you to pass on the wisdom that you have gained from 25 years of service in the tabernacle. And I want you to protect and teach and mentor that young person in spiritual things. That's what God was doing with this by making them retire at 50 years old. Now that's okay when you're wandering around in the wilderness, when you're setting up a tent and pulling it down, and when you've got people living all around like this who are coming to the tabernacle all of the time to do sacrifices. But what happens when your wilderness wanderings come to an end? What happens when the tabernacle is now permanently set up? Or even more, if your tabernacle is now put into storage and there's now a temple? What does your family do of the Kohathites, of the sons of Korah? What do they do when they no longer have to pack up the tabernacle and move it and set it up again? What happens when this responsibility sort of comes to an end? We'll come over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Sorry, 1 Chronicles chapter 9, not Corinthians. Right. We've spent a bit of time getting to this point, okay? And this is where we're going to introduce the word porters for the first time this evening. Verse 17 of 1 Chronicles 9. And the porters were Shallum, Achab, Talman, Ahimam and their brethren, and Shallum was chief, who hitherto waited in the king's gate eastward. They were porters in the companies of the children of Levi. And Shallum, the son of Kor, the son of Ebiasaph, the son of Korah, and his brethren of the house of his father, the Korahites, were over the work of the service, keepers of the gates of the tabernacle. And their fathers, being over the host of Yahweh, were keepers of the entry. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, was ruler over them in time past, and Yahweh was with him. You see, David understood that in that nation there was a group of people, when he set up the courses and the roles that the tabernacle worship would have when he came to the throne, and then helped his son to take that even further. He knew that within that nation there was a family who had camped around the tabernacle, who had opened up worship, who had closed worship, and who had protected worship. during the 40 years of wilderness wanderings, and he said, I've got the perfect job for them. I'm going to make them gatekeepers in the temple of God. And they're going to do three things. Those gatekeepers are going to open the worship of each day by opening the doors of the temple or the tabernacle. They're going to open it up and they're going to invite people in to worship. At the end of the day, they're going to close worship by closing the doors when the temple or the tabernacle was cleaned and when it was prepared, when the laver was filled up, when the wood was when the wood was filled up for the altar, and when all the carcasses were cleaned and taken away. That family closed the temple for the day. And between the opening and closing time of the temple, those porters were there to stop anyone coming into that temple who should not be there, to protect the worship in the temple and keep it as God wanted it. All right? That's what David designed. See, in verse 22, all these which were chosen to be porters in the gates were 212. These were reckoned by their genealogy in their villages. So to be a porter, you had to trace your family line back to Levi through this family here, whom David and Samuel the seer did ordain in their office. So Samuel sat down with David and they designed how the tabernacle was going to operate. And then when David was thinking about the house of God that he wanted to build, he would then take that basis that he and Samuel had gone through and he would expand that and make it bigger. You see, Samuel never saw what he had designed with David in action. He died 10 to 20 years before David came to the throne. But Samuel's grandson helped David to go on and set up those priests and those orders of worship and the courses of the priests who would come up and serve in the tabernacle. Samuel's grandson helped him because Samuel wasn't around when David came to the throne to do that. And in verse 27, we find, oddly enough, that the porters lodged around about the house of God because, here's our phrase again, the charge was upon them, and the opening thereof every morning pertained to them. And certain of them had the charge of ministering vessels, that they should bring them in and out by tale. And some of them also were appointed to oversee the vessels and all the instruments of the sanctuary, and the fine flour, and the wine, and the oil, and the frankincense, and spices. And some of the sons of the priests made ointment of the spices. And Mattathiah, one of the Levites, who was the firstborn of Shallum the Korite, had the set office over the things that were made in the pans. And other of their brethren of the Kohathites were over the showbread to prepare it every Sabbath. So there you are. You have the family of Kohath, of the Korites, linked with opening and closing the worship each day. And they became the security of the temple. But now here's another thing, another little quirk to this famous family. In verse 33, and these are the singers, chief of the fathers of the Levites, who remaining in the chambers were free, for they were employed in that work day and night. So there were certain people in this family who didn't have a specific job to do. They didn't have anything to look after. In fact, their whole job was to remain in the temple for the purpose of singing, of praise, and of worship to God. And that's where we get the sons of Korah and singing and worship brought together right in that verse there. This is the first time that we have the mention of the singers. And of course, our Psalms, or the book of Psalms that we've got, is full of songs that these people would have sung. In fact, we've got songs which David wrote, some of which David wrote, for these people to sing. And we've got two different types of psalms that these that this family would sing, the sons of Korah. We've got Psalms 4, the sons of Korah, and we've got Psalms of the sons of Korah. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that the Psalms for the sons of Korah are Psalm 42, 43, 44, and 45, okay? Now, hymn 25 that we're going to sing at the end tonight is 43, I think. It's Psalm 43, all right? It's a psalm for the sons of Korah. These were psalms that were written to teach the sons of Korah about worship of God, okay? They were for teaching of the sons of Korah. But the psalms of the sons of Korah, of which are 47, 48, 49, 84, 85, and 87, these were psalms of reflection about the experiences that the sons of Korah had and had put into words and into song. Okay, so there's two different types of psalms. Now, the hymn that we sang to start with, sorry, it was a bit of a doozy, it's a little bit high, but that's actually Psalm 84. That was our reading tonight. That's why we picked it, okay? And it's almost word for word, and it was a bit hard to sing. But nevertheless, that's why we picked it, all right? Now, so we've got all these psalms written by David for this family, or written by Asaph, or written by the sons of Korah themselves to sing, to make music, to reflect on their experiences, or to teach other people about right worship to God. And that one that we read tonight was all about, of course, that the joy of being a doorkeeper in the house of God. That was that phrase that I said, keep a lookout for that. Doorkeeper, being a porter in the house of God, because that's what this family became under the leadership of David when he set up the temple worship and the tabernacle worship in the nation. Now come over to Nehemiah chapter 11. Nehemiah chapter 11. Now, Nehemiah is written after they returned from captivity, okay? So, what we've just been talking about David in 1 Chronicles 9, David setting up all of the temple worship or the tabernacle worship right at the start of the nation of Israel. Well, now, in Nehemiah 11, we've now gone through all of the kings and all of the prophets. The nation of Israel has gone into captivity. They've come back again. And now we've got the book of Nehemiah. And what do we find in Nehemiah chapter 11 and verse 19? Well, we find, moreover, the porters, Akkub, Talmon, and their brethren that kept the gates were 172. 172 of these guards or guardians of the worship of God returned from Babylon to help establish the nation again. And in chapter 12 verse 25, we have Mattaniah, Bakbukiah, Obadiah, Meshullam, Talmon, Akkub were porters keeping the ward at the thresholds of the gates. And then we have verse 44. At that time were some appointed over the chambers, for the treasures, for the offerings, for the first fruits, for the tithes, to gather them in out of the fields of the cities, the portions of the law of the priests and the Levites. For Judah rejoiced for the priests and for the Levites that waited. And in verse 45, we have the singers and the porters there that kept the ward of their God and the ward of purification according to the commandment of David and Solomon his son. All right? So here is this faithful family, this faithful group of people who have returned from captivity to continue guarding and keeping the charge of looking after temple worship and godliness within a temple. Now, Psalm 85 was written at this time, around this time, and these singers sang Psalm 85. Nehemiah chapter 12 is about 1,000 years after Korah first perished in Numbers chapter 16. This same family was still serving God. Now that's an incredible legacy, isn't it? How many of you can trace your family line back 1,000 years? Probably maybe, I don't know, 1 or 2, maybe 3 generations, but not much further than that, can you? This family had been serving God in worship for 1,000 years. So what's the point of this story? What's the point of the story of this family? Well, the point of the story of this family and of these porters is trust, okay? It's all about trust. Now, I want to tell you about 3 famous people in the Bible who were all porters that God could trust. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, and you can go and read it yourself later on in 2nd Chronicles 23 for time's sake, all right? Now, let's go to 2nd Chronicles 23. It's easier. Second Chronicles 23. I don't know if you've read this story or not, but there's a little kid, a baby in fact, called Joash. Joash's grandma had killed all of his brothers and sisters. Okay? She's a crazy woman. Her name's Athaliah. She kills all of his brothers and sisters, and he is a tiny little baby. He's the only one left in his family, and he is of the king's line, okay? Now, don't forget that the king's line starts in David and ends in the Lord Jesus Christ. So at this point in time, the line between David and the Lord Jesus Christ has come down to the life of one tiny little baby, because one crazy woman has killed the rest of the kids in that family. And there's a faithful man, a priest in the temple called Jehoiada. He grabs this baby and he hides the baby in the temple for 7 years, okay? Now, after the end of 7 years, Jehoiada gathers all of the Levites together into the temple and he says, right, the time has come. We're going to anoint this child to be king. Because this grandma, Athaliah, was ruling as the queen at the time. She was a wicked woman. And Jehoiada said, no, this is the rightful heir. And he shows all of the Levites this little boy that he saved in this temple for 7 years. And the Levites, they couldn't believe it. There was one remaining child left in this family, and he was going to be king. And have a look in verse 4. Jehoiada says to them, right, this is the thing that you'll do. A third part of you entering on the Sabbath of the priests and of the Levites shall be porters of the doors. And a third shall be at the king's house, and a third at the gate of the foundation, and all of the people shall be in the courts of the house of Yahweh. And what were they to do? In verse 7, the Levites shall compass the king round about, every man with his weapon on his hand, and whosoever else cometh into the house, he shall be put to death. But be ye with the king when he cometh out, and when he goeth in. So he says, right, a third of you are going to surround this temple, and at every gate you are going to act as guardians, doorkeepers, porters. and you're going to stay there. Do not let anybody into this temple that shouldn't be in here. A third of you will surround the king, this little boy, everyone with a weapon. You're his personal bodyguards. Do not let anyone come near this king. And then what he did is he took the king and he anointed him and he put the crown on his head. And everyone said, "Long live the king." And Athaliah tried to get into that temple, all right, and find out what was going on. But the porters were there. They guarded the temple doors. They guarded the temple gates, and she could not get to that king because of those faithful Levites, those faithful sons of Korah. What's the lesson? Well, Jehoiada said, identify sin, someone who isn't supposed to be in the temple, and keep it out. All right? That's the first lesson from the porter. Identify sin in your own life and in your ecclesia and keep it out. Guard your ecclesia against things that shouldn't be in there. That's what it means to us today. Now here's the second story. Come back to 1 Chronicles chapter 9. 1 Chronicles 9, verse 27. Now, we've already read this verse. And the porters, they lodged around about the house of God because the charge was upon them, and the opening, and you could add to that verse, and the closing, the opening and closing thereof every morning pertained to them. The job of the porters was to open and to close the doors of the temple, signifying the start of worship and the end of worship every single day. So keep that in the back of your mind. We've got to link 3 quotes together. Come back to chapter 6. Chapter 6. And verse 33. These are they that waited with their children, okay, in the service of God. Of the sons of the Kohathites, Heman a singer, okay, the son of Joel, okay, the son of Shemuel, okay, the son of Elkanah. Oh, hang on a minute. Who was the son of Elkanah that has a name that sounds like Shemuel? Samuel. Samuel, the son of Elkanah, was a son of Korah. He was a Levite of the family of the Kohathites through Korah. And guess what Samuel's job was every day in the tabernacle when he was living there with Levi? When he was living with Eli, not Levi, sorry. He got up in the morning, 1 Samuel 3 verse 15, if you're taking notes. 1 Samuel 3 verse 15, Samuel got up every morning and opened the doors of the tabernacle. And he was a son of Korah. Lesson number 2. Open the doors for worship. Bring people in to worship God. Tell people that our ecclesias and that our homes are open for worship. Yes, keep sin out, but open the doors to let people know that the time for worshipping God in our ecclesias and our homes is now. And bring people in to do it the right way. That's our responsibility. And the third story was when David was bringing the ark up to Jerusalem. Come over to 2 Samuel chapter 6. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, David is bringing the ark up to Jerusalem. And we know the story. He had it on a cart, didn't he? And it went over a piece of rocky ground, and the cart wobbled, and the ark wobbled. And Uzzah, a Levite, put out his hand to touch it, and he was struck dead instantly. And in verse 9, David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How shall the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David would not remove the ark of the Lord unto him into the city of David, but David carried it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Who was going to touch that ark? The ark hadn't fallen off. The ark was still sitting there on the cart behind those oxen where it had stopped, and there was a dead man laying on the ground, and David was terrified. Who's going to touch that ark? Well, a faithful man from a faithful family called Obed-Edom came out of his house, and he touched the ark. He picked that ark up. He was the one who had the courage to walk up to that ark and touch it after a man had been struck dead. And he carried that ark into his house. In verse 11, the ark of Yahweh continued in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Because that man had had the faith to do what was right and the courage to pick that ark up and take it inside his house. And God blessed him for that. Now come over to 1 Chronicles 15. Because in 1 Chronicles 15 is the end of this story. Now this is the second time that David then attempted to bring the ark to Jerusalem. And in verse 14, the priests and the Levites sanctified themselves to bring up the ark of Yahweh, God of Israel. And the children of the Levites this time bear the ark of God upon their shoulders with the staves thereon, as Moses commanded according to the word of Yahweh. And David spoke to the chief of the Levites to appoint their children to be singers, with instruments of music, psalteries and harps and cymbals sounding, by lifting up the voice of joy. Now come over to verse 24. And Shebaniah and Jehoshaphat and Nethaneel and Amasaiah, Zechariah and Benaiah and Eleazar, the priests, did blow with the trumpets before the ark of God. And Obed-Edom and Jehiah were doorkeepers for the ark. Have you ever heard that phrase before? Doorkeepers for the ark. Obed-Edom, because of his faith, had been appointed as a protector and a guard of that ark that had caused a man to be struck dead. Because he had the faith to pick it up. And he was appointed a doorkeeper of the ark. Now don't turn to it, but in 1 Chronicles 26, it says that Obed-Edom was a son of Korah. Strange how God works in people's lives, isn't it? So the lesson is, let your house be a dwelling place for God. And that's the 3 lessons tonight from the porter, from the job of a porter. And it wasn't an exciting job. It was a humble job. It was a job where you were out in the cold, sometimes at night, on your own, maybe with someone else. It's not glamorous. But look at what the writer of Psalm 84 says. We'll finish off. This is our last quote tonight, Psalm 84. Look what he says. In verse 10. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000. I would rather, says the psalmist, I'd rather be just a simple doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Dwell in the tents of wickedness. But when you understand this family and the sons of Korah singing their psalm, what had happened in their family's history to the tents of wickedness? Well, the ground had opened up and those tents had plunged into them and those people were never seen again, weren't they? And the psalmist says, you know what? I don't want to be down there because that's where you perish forever. I'd rather have the simplest job in all the world. It's not glamorous, it's not amazing, it's not going to bring me fame and wealth, but I'm at one with God. In the house of God is where I want to be. I love that place. I just want to look out from those doors. I want to open them every morning. I want to close them every night. And I want to let people in who want to be there. And God, those that want to dwell in the tents of wickedness, they will fall into the depths of the earth, never to be seen again. And in verse 11, he says, because no good thing will he withhold from those that walk uprightly. Now, being a porter was all about trust, wasn't it? Trust that God could have in you to do the right thing at the right time, to act faithfully. And these are the three lessons. And I guess the question, as we finish up tonight, looking at this role of the porters in the Bible, is can God trust in you?